The Whittaker home is still standing, but it doesn't sound like it used to. No constant movement, no overlapping voices, no familiar rhythm of people moving in and out of the same space. Just two aging voices inside a house that suddenly feels larger than it ever has before. And that is where the story begins now. Not with what went viral, not with what people think they know, but with what happens after everything goes quiet. There's a question that splits everyone still paying attention. Was what happened to this family protection, or was it punishment? Not in theory, not in policy language, but in real life, as it's being lived by the people who remain behind. Because whatever words were used on paper, the result was the same. Overnight, the Whittaker home changed forever. Odd, West Virginia doesn't look like the kind of place where national attention should land. It's rural, isolated, a place where life moves slowly because it has to. The Whittaker property sits on a dirt road, surrounded by the evidence of long-term survival rather than comfort. Rusted items left where they stopped being useful. Broken things that were never replaced because replacement was never an option. Clutter that doesn't come from neglect alone, but from years of making do with what you have. Inside the home, the details tell a harder story. A calendar on the wall frozen in a month that already passed. A television left on, filling the air with noise even when no one is watching. Food left out too long, not out of carelessness, but because routines broke down slowly and no one noticed when the line was crossed. Decorations outside that blur holidays together, not because anyone was celebrating, but because time itself stopped feeling organized. But in 2026, decay isn't the most important change. Absence is. Only two people remain in that house now. Betty and Larry, two siblings in their 70s, sitting in a space that once held 5 lives. And that absence isn't neutral. It presses in on everything. It changes how the house feels, how it sounds, how safe it is. Silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it means something has been taken away so completely that even grief doesn't know where to go. Betty is in her early 70s. Larry is close behind her. They're not just alone. They're living inside the echo of a family that was removed all at once. And that removal didn't come with closure. It came with instructions that sounded more like warnings. Don't talk to anyone. Don't say anything. Don't invite attention. So now the Whittaker home is a place where the door may still open, but the story stays shut. What happened next is where the heartbreak deepens. In September 2025, Adult Protective Services intervened. 3 members of the household were removed: Ray, Laureen, and Timmy. One day, they were part of daily life. The next, they were gone. No gradual transition. No time to process. Just absence. And for the 2 left behind, the explanation was painfully thin. Betty said she was told they were helping, that the 3 couldn't live there anymore. No roadmap, no timeline, no reassurance she could hold on to. And then she said something simple that cuts through every argument about policy or procedure. I missed them a lot. I raised them. Larry described his days as waiting. Waiting for a phone call. Waiting for news. Waiting to be told something, anything, about where they were taken. And as of now, there has been no confirmation shared publicly. No location. No update that outsiders can point to and say, at least we know they're okay. And that silence is not just painful. It's destabilizing. People can endure bad news. What they can't endure is uncertainty that never resolves. Silence leaves room for fear. And fear fills the gaps when facts are withheld. That fear isn't just happening online. It's happening inside that house, every day, to the people who are still there. A family doesn't stop being a family because the state intervenes. Love doesn't end when paperwork changes hands. And the cruelest part of this story isn't only that the family was separated. It's that the separation came with no answers the remaining family could live with. This is where the word protection starts to feel complicated. Because the 3 who were removed are now effectively under state guardianship. Wards of the state. That phrase alone redraws the entire map. It means decisions about housing, medical care, and contact are no longer made by the people who share their lives with them. They're made by systems. And systems don't explain themselves to the public. Often, they legally can't. That's why the story went quiet. Not because nothing is happening, but because confidentiality took over. There are two definitions of care colliding here. One is familial care, imperfect, poor, chaotic, but rooted in keeping everyone together at all costs. The other is institutional care, regulated, clean, monitored, built around standards instead of bonds. And when the second definition takes control, the first doesn't just lose, it disappears. For some people watching from the outside, that sounds like relief. Clean environments, regular meals, medical oversight. For others, it feels like something irreplaceable was taken. The only world Ray, Laureen, and Timmy ever knew. The routines that made sense to them, even if they didn't make sense to outsiders. And here's the truth no one can honestly claim to know. We do not have verified, public updates on how those three are doing now. No confirmed statements. No official reassurances released for public consumption. And that unknown is exactly what keeps pulling people back to this story. The internet wants proof of life. A new image. A new clip. Something to resolve the discomfort of not knowing. But resolution is not always ethical. This is where the story turns darker. Because while the home deteriorated and outsiders claimed they wanted to help, something else grew around the Whittakers. A monetized orbit. Online pages. Paid subscriptions. Exclusive content. Plans that sounded like salvation but came with cameras and control. Two men positioned themselves as benefactors. Promoted fundraising. Promised a new house. A better life. And when it collapsed, Larry later said money meant for the family never reached them the way it was supposed to. Large sums discussed. Accusations that haven't been resolved. And then the line that matters most, law enforcement stepped in. In September 2025, West Virginia State Police opened a fraud investigation tied to fundraising connected to the Whittaker family. Investigators named individuals of interest and asked donors to come forward. That investigation is still described as ongoing. This is not internet drama. This is law enforcement. And when trust collapses at that level, the fallout doesn't land on the people with platforms. It lands on the people who can't protect themselves. The dream of a new house never happened. The old house remains. The family is split. And the silence that followed is heavier because of what came before it. So now we are in the aftermath. Two elderly siblings in a house too large to maintain. Three family members somewhere else, behind a wall of confidentiality. And a public that doesn't know whether to see the silence as safety or cruelty. This is no longer a story about how the Whittakers became who they are. It's about what happens when attention leaves scars instead of solutions. And that brings us to the question that matters now. If the state removed three people for safety, should the two left behind at least be told they are alive, stable, and cared for? Comment one word, protection or punishment, and explain why. When people argue about whether this was protection or punishment, they usually focus on the moment the state stepped in. The cars, the paperwork, the sudden disappearance of three family members from a home that, for better or worse, had kept them together for decades. But the truth is, the most important consequences didn't happen that day. They happened afterward, in a long stretch of time where no one explains what comes next. Because removal is not an ending. It's the beginning of a new kind of uncertainty. After Ray, Laureen, and Timmy were taken, the house didn't just lose people. It lost function. The Whittaker home was never organized by modern standards, but it operated on shared roles. Someone noticed when another person didn't eat. Someone reacted when a sound changed or a routine broke. Survival came from proximity, not planning. And once that proximity vanished, everything else became harder. For Betty and Larry, daily life shifted into something fragile and watchful. Every action suddenly felt like it might be interpreted. Every visitor felt risky. Every word spoken to the wrong person could bring consequences they didn't understand or control. This isn't paranoia. It's what happens when people with limited power realize decisions about their lives are being made elsewhere. Larry has been described as quieter since the removal. Not withdrawn in a dramatic way, but careful, as if he believes silence is a form of safety. As if the house itself learned a rule: attention equals danger. That kind of silence isn't peace. It's restraint. Betty, meanwhile, carries a different weight. Her entire adult identity was built around caretaking. She didn't just live with her siblings. She structured her life around them, feeding them, cleaning around them, watching over them, protecting them from the outside world in the only way she knew how, by keeping them close. When those three were removed, Betty didn't just lose family. She lost purpose. That kind of loss doesn't show up in reports. It doesn't trigger emergency interventions, but it erodes someone quietly. Days stretch longer. Nights feel heavier, and the house becomes a reminder of what's missing instead of a place of belonging. This is the part of state intervention that almost never gets discussed. Systems are designed to assess risk, not meaning. They evaluate safety, not identity. And while those priorities are often necessary, they leave emotional wreckage behind that no agency is tasked with repairing. For the three who were taken, life likely changed in ways that are both stabilizing and disorienting. That's the uncomfortable truth. State care is not inherently cruel, and it's not inherently kind. It is structured, predictable, regulated. And for people who lived in chaos, that can feel like relief or like imprisonment, depending on how much agency they're allowed to keep. Ray spent most of his life being interpreted instead of understood. Sounds he made became labels. Behaviors became jokes. What outsiders didn't see was how stress amplified those behaviors, how instability turned coping mechanisms into symptoms. In environments with consistent care, those behaviors often lessen, not because the person changed, but because the pressure did. Laureen lived almost her entire life inside the same orbit, aging in place without the medical oversight most elderly people receive. Chronic conditions were managed informally. Injuries healed slowly. Her removal likely came with medical evaluations that should have happened years earlier. That doesn't erase the trauma of being taken, but it does complicate the idea that nothing good could come from intervention. And then there's Timmy. Timmy's story has always been distorted by visibility. He was treated as a character, a symbol, a face that belonged to the public because people felt emotionally invested. That kind of attention strips agency away. It teaches someone that their value comes from being watched. In a structured environment without cameras, Timmy's world may have shrunk, but it may also have become safer. Without strangers approaching him, without expectations to perform, without being filmed as proof of someone else's compassion. That doesn't mean separation was painless. Familiar routines matter deeply, especially for people who rely on predictability to feel secure. Removal disrupts that in ways that can't be smoothed over with clean rooms and scheduled meals. But here's the truth that sits at the center of all of this. We don't actually know how they are doing now. And that's intentional. Adult protective cases are sealed to prevent exploitation. The same curiosity that once drove attention is the reason silence exists now. The law doesn't differentiate between concern and entitlement. It treats all outside interest as potential harm. That's why updates are rare, why names aren't spoken, why locations aren't shared, and why the internet feels shut out of story it once believed it owned. The problem is that silence doesn't just block spectators. It blocks family too. Betty and Larry aren't asking for addresses. They aren't demanding visits. They're waiting for reassurance, for confirmation that the people they love are alive, stable, and being treated with dignity. And as of now, that reassurance hasn't come in a form they can understand or trust. This is where the question of punishment begins to surface. Because if the goal was protection, why does it feel like everyone involved was punished? The 3 who were taken lost their home and routines. The 2 who remained lost their family and their sense of safety. And the public lost transparency, which only fuels speculation and distrust. Add to that the shadow of financial exploitation, and the picture becomes even darker. When money entered this story, it didn't come with safeguards. Donations were raised in the family's name without clear oversight. Promises were made without accountability. And when those promises collapsed, the consequences didn't land on the people who controlled the platforms. They landed on the family. Law enforcement stepping in wasn't just about missing funds. It was about recognizing a pattern that had gone unchecked for too long. Vulnerability became currency. Suffering became content. And the Whittakers became a resource others could extract from. Once that structure fell apart, the state stepped in, not just to protect people, but to contain damage. And containment often looks like silence. So now we're left with a home that still stands, but doesn't function the way it used to. 2 people aging inside it, aware that one misstep could trigger another intervention. 3 people somewhere else, adjusting to a life they didn't choose and can't explain to anyone who asks. This is not a clean story. There are no heroes here, no perfect villains, just systems colliding with human lives that were never built to withstand this level of attention. The question isn't whether the state was right to act. The question is whether anyone is prepared to deal with what happens after action. Because safety without connection can become another kind of harm, and connection without safety can be deadly. Somewhere between those 2 truths is where the Whittaker story is now. Unfinished, unresolved, and heavier than ever. And the hardest part is this: the silence that feels cruel may also be the only thing keeping further damage from happening. That doesn't make it easier to accept. It just makes it real. There's a point in every story like this where people stop asking what happened and start asking who failed. And in the Whittaker case, that question doesn't have a clean answer because failure didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated slowly, layered year after year, until the structure finally collapsed under its own weight. For decades, the Whittakers lived in survival mode. Not crisis mode, survival mode. There's a difference. Crisis is loud and urgent. Survival is quiet and repetitive. You wake up, you get through the day, you manage what you can, and you accept what you can't. Over time, that becomes normal. And when survival becomes normal, danger stops feeling like danger. It just feels like life. That's the context most outsiders missed. The home deteriorated not because no one cared, but because caring wasn't enough. Poverty, isolation, disability, aging, and lack of access stacked on top of one another until maintenance became impossible. When people talk about neglect, they imagine cruelty or indifference. But neglect can also look like exhaustion. It can look like doing the same inadequate thing every day because you don't know another option exists. Betty didn't wake up one morning and decide to fail her family. She woke up every day trying to keep things going with fewer resources, less energy, and more responsibility than anyone should carry alone. Larry didn't choose dependency. He adapted to a world that never adapted to him. Ray and Timmy didn't choose vulnerability. They lived inside it. So when the state finally intervened, it wasn't responding to one incident. It was responding to a pattern that had become impossible to ignore. But here's where the conversation gets uncomfortable. The same internet that demanded intervention is now demanding explanations it isn't entitled to. The same viewers who once criticized the conditions are now criticizing the silence. And both reactions come from the same place, a belief that visibility equals accountability. That belief isn't wrong, but it's incomplete. Accountability requires structure, and the Whittakers never had that. What they had was exposure. Exposure brought money, attention, and promises. It also brought chaos, pressure, and people who confuse proximity with authority. When outside figures began inserting themselves into the family's life, lines blurred fast. Who was helping? Who was managing? Who was deciding? The family didn't have the capacity to answer those questions. So others answered for them. And when that informal power structure collapsed, when trust eroded and accusation surfaced, the state stepped in to impose a formal one. This is the part people don't like to hear. The removal wasn't just about safety. It was about control. Not control in a sinister sense, but in a legal one. The state needed to regain control of a situation that had spiraled beyond the family's ability to manage and beyond the public's ability to responsibly engage with. Once that happens, transparency disappears, because transparency invites interference. From a legal standpoint, silence is protection. From a human standpoint, silence feels like abandonment. Both can be true at the same time. What we do know is that once adult protective services establishes guardianship or equivalent authority, the focus shifts from family wishes to assessed best interest. That assessment prioritizes physical safety, medical stability, and reduced risk of exploitation. Emotional continuity ranks lower, not because it doesn't matter, but because it's harder to measure and harder to guarantee. That's why visits become restricted. That's why communication becomes limited. That's why even basic information can be withheld. It's not about punishment. It's about liability. And liability is where the story gets colder. The state doesn't want another scandal. It doesn't want another viral moment. It doesn't want to risk someone filming, monetizing, or manipulating the people in its care. So the safest option becomes distance. Fewer updates. Fewer points of contact. Fewer chances for something to go wrong. But that safety comes at a cost. For Betty and Larry, it means living in a house that now feels provisional. Not quite home, not quite under threat, but never secure. Every knock could be help, or the beginning of another removal. Every illness feels heavier because they don't know who will respond or how the response will change their future. For the three who were taken, it means learning a new life without the people who define their old one. New routines, new caregivers, new expectations. Even if those changes improve physical health, they still sever emotional ties that were never replaced. And for the public, it means sitting with uncertainty instead of closure. That uncertainty has led to speculation, rumors, and misinformation, some of it well-intentioned, some of it harmful. Claims about deaths, claims about secret locations, claims about conditions with no evidence. Each rumor spreads faster than any verified update ever could. That's why this part matters. Because misinformation doesn't just confuse viewers. It affects real people. Every false claim increases scrutiny. Every viral post increases pressure. Every theory invites someone to check for themselves, which puts the remaining family at risk. Attention doesn't stay online. It travels down roads and onto porches. And that's exactly what the system is trying to prevent. So when people ask, why won't they just tell us how they're doing? The answer is simple and painful, because telling you could make things worse. That doesn't mean silence is fair. It means silence is calculated. Now we have to confront the hardest question of all. If intervention was necessary, was it done too late? Years earlier, with proper support, the family might have stayed together. With consistent medical care, home repairs, oversight, and financial management, removal might never have been needed. But those supports never arrived in a coordinated way. What arrived instead was attention, sporadic, unregulated, and driven by emotion rather than infrastructure. By the time the state stepped in, the options were limited. There was no gentle fix left, only decisive action. That's the tragedy no one wants to claim responsibility for. Not the family, not the helpers, not the viewers, not the system. Everyone arrived too late, and now everyone is paying for it. This is where the story stops being about blame and starts being about restraint. Because the worst thing that could happen next isn't that we don't know enough. It's that someone decides they know enough to act without consent, without verification, without understanding the consequences. The Whittakers have already been harmed by people who believe they were helping. They don't need more of that. So here's the line that matters now. If you care about this family, the most ethical thing you can do is protect their privacy, challenge misinformation, and resist the urge to fill silence with speculation. Concern is not a license to intrude. Curiosity is not a form of care. And if you have real, verifiable information, public records, confirmed reporting, first-hand updates shared with permission, that's different. That kind of information can help build accountability without causing harm. Everything else just adds noise to a story that's already heavy with loss. The Whittaker home didn't go silent because no one cares. It went silent because too many people cared the wrong way. And now, the only path forward is quieter, slower, and far less satisfying than the internet wants, but far safer for the people who still have to live inside the consequences. So here's the question I want you to answer thoughtfully, not emotionally. Do you believe silence, in this case, is protecting the vulnerable or punishing the family left behind? Comment one word, protection or punishment, and tell me why. There's a moment in every long-running tragedy where the focus quietly shifts. Not because the story is over, but because the damage has settled into permanence. That's where the Whittaker case sits now. Not in crisis, not in rescue, but in consequence. By 2026, the most dangerous thing facing the remaining family members isn't intervention. It's erosion. Erosion doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with sirens or court orders. It happens in small losses that stack up over time. A missed appointment, a delayed repair, a day without enough food, a winter night that feels longer than it used to. When 3 people are removed from a household like this, the system assumes the remaining adults can compensate. But aging doesn't work that way. Grief doesn't work that way. Trauma doesn't work that way. Betty and Larry are not simply alone. They are carrying the psychological weight of removal while still being observed by the same system that removed the others. That creates a pressure cooker dynamic. Every choice feels like a test. Every misstep feels like proof. And when people live under that kind of watchfulness, they don't stabilize, they shrink. This is what rarely gets discussed about adult protective intervention. Once the state steps in, the household doesn't return in neutral. It becomes provisional, temporary, conditional. The message isn't spoken out loud, but it's understood. You're still being evaluated. That changes behavior. People stop asking for help because help can trigger scrutiny. They stop inviting outsiders because outsiders can report concerns. They stop fixing problems openly because admitting a problem feels dangerous. Silence becomes a survival strategy, not because nothing is wrong, but because saying something feels riskier than saying nothing. And that's how isolation deepens. This is why misinformation is so corrosive in cases like this. Every rumor about deaths, arrests, secret locations, or imminent removals adds to the pressure. Even when false, those rumors increase attention. Attention increases risk. Risk invites intervention. The system doesn't investigate intent, it investigates outcomes. And here's the uncomfortable truth no one wants to sit with. The state doesn't need to be malicious to cause harm. It only needs to be cautious. Caution prioritizes liability reduction over emotional continuity. It favors decisions that look defensible on paper. And from that perspective, limiting contact limiting information and limiting access makes sense. It reduces variables. It minimizes exposure. It protects against accusations of negligence. But caution doesn't comfort the people left behind. Betty didn't lose 3 family members because she stopped loving them. She lost them because love alone wasn't enough to meet modern standards of care. That distinction matters, because when people frame this as punishment, they're responding to emotional truth. When others frame it as protection, they're responding to procedural truth. Both exist. Neither cancels the other out. And then there's the house. The house isn't just a structure. It's evidence. It's history. It's the physical record of how this family lived and what they endured. But in 2026, the house is also a liability. An aging property with deferred maintenance, environmental hazards, and limited capacity for modification. Fixing it would require money, oversight, and sustained support, none of which can happen quietly. Every repair draws attention. Every inspection creates a record. Every improvement raises questions about why it wasn't done sooner and who is responsible now. So the house sits in limbo, just like the people inside it. This is the part where well-meaning outsiders often get it wrong. They see a problem and think the solution is direct action. Go there, clean it, fix it, film it, fund it. But that instinct ignores how systems respond to unsanctioned help. Outside intervention without coordination can backfire badly. It can trigger enforcement, invalidate existing plans, or even accelerate removal. Helping without permission can look like interference. That's why restraint matters now more than ever. If there is a path forward that keeps Betty and Larry in their home safely, it will not come from viral pressure. It will come from slow, boring things. Case reviews, social worker discretion, medical evaluations, housing assessments, support services that don't require publicity to function. None of that is satisfying to watch, but it's the only kind of help that doesn't put them at further risk. And this brings us to the question everyone avoids because it doesn't have a villain. What if no one wins here? What if the system did what it was designed to do too late, and the family did what it could for too long, and the internet made everything louder without making anything safer? That doesn't mean accountability disappears. It means accountability becomes nuanced. Those who profited from exposure deserve scrutiny. Systems that failed to intervene earlier deserve reform. Communities that ignored warning signs deserve reflection. But none of that justifies turning the present moment into another spectacle. Because the Whittakers aren't a cautionary tale anymore. They're an aging family navigating the aftermath of attention they never asked for and control they no longer have. So before sharing another rumor, before demanding another update, before speculating about what comes next, pause and ask one hard question. Does what I'm about to say make their lives safer? Or just make me feel informed? Because in this stage of the story, feeling informed isn't the same as being helpful. And silence, as uncomfortable as it is, might be the only thing standing between the remaining family and another irreversible loss. So choose your words carefully. They matter more now than ever. What remains in 2026 isn't a mystery to be solved, but a responsibility to be handled carefully. The Whittaker story no longer needs exposure. It needs restraint. 3 family members were removed in the name of safety. 2 remain in a home shaped by grief, age, and fear of saying the wrong thing. Whether that separation was protection or punishment depends on where you stand, but what happens next will define everything. The danger now isn't neglect alone. It's pressure. Pressure from rumors. Pressure from attention. Pressure from people who believe knowing more is the same as helping more. If the state has one obligation, it's this: dignity through stability. If the public has one obligation, it's to stop turning silence into speculation. And if anyone truly wants to help, the path forward is slow, verified, and unglamorous. No cameras, no drive-bys, no assumptions, just patience, accountability where it belongs, and respect for lives that were never meant to be content. So here's the question that matters now. Answer honestly. Was what happened protection or punishment? Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.